I'm Van Sebastian here with my co-host S.A. Baz Collins for this week's Written on the Edge Season 9 Episode 46 interview. We'll be talking with Trent Clifford and discussing his recent work, Reclaiming Faith. So let's get to know our guest. Trent Clifford is a poet, speaker, spiritual director, abuse survivor, proclaimer of truth, reclaimer of faith, and he's passionate about reimagining spirituality. Originally working as a children's pastor, Trent left congregational ministry when he came out as queer. He pivoted and has spent the better part of his adult life in the professional theater as a director, actor, and playwright. And now Trent's dipped his lifelong skills as a storyteller to bring back the divine into his life. Trent, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Our pleasure. And happy Black Friday, everyone. Dun, da, da, da. Kick off to the holidays. So, you've obviously been a storyteller your whole life, but the art of taking those words and putting them into a book and then editing it 16,000 times is very different. What was that passion? Why did you want to tell this story?
It really came from a desire to pen my own experience. The book was something that I was writing as I was living it. The book is part memoir, but it's really me describing my own journey back into faith, something that I grew up with, something that was deeply important to me, but something that I had been kind of forcibly removed from because people told me that it wasn't for me. And so this is kind of getting into the story, but it's really like what motivated me to write this, because I didn't set out to write a book necessarily. That wasn't really the goal as I started writing it. My goal was to make sense of what I was experiencing. And what I was experiencing was I had come out of an abusive marriage. And a year outside of that, I really started recognizing the ways in which that abusive marriage mirrored my relationship with the church. The way that this divorce from my ex-husband felt so similar in ways to this divorce from organized religion. And so the motivation to write this book was really me trying to make sense of that as I journeyed back into something that was important to me. So, I didn't set out to be a book writer, and yet here I am with a book under my belt.
Did it start as more journaling?
It did. And there's actually, like, the first chapter has a page from my journal, just literally taken from a journal and typed into a book.
So, at what point during your journaling did you realize you wanted to share this with others?
So, pretty quickly, I knew that it was something that I wanted to share. But really, at the time, that didn't translate into a published book just yet. So I knew I wanted to make sense of it beyond just pages in my journal. I started transcribing them and organizing thoughts and thinking through how I would explain to someone else in a similar space how to do the journey in a similar way that I was. I was hoping to offer insight and help. When something like faith has wounded you, how do you interact with that again in an authentic way, in a way that feels truthful and healing? And so I started just sending chapters or chunks to a friend of mine. And that's how it started, was just emailing organized thoughts to someone I trusted. And then those organized thoughts became chapters, and that chapters became a book. And then I realized that I had something that was maybe a little bit more than just sharing with a few people, but that had an audience, because the church has wounded so many. And yet I think that there is a part of us, for so many of us, who still craves that spirituality, that centering presence of something divine, something outside of ourselves. But it's so inaccessible for so many of us after we've had these experiences with organized Christian persons who would rather persecute than love. And so I realized that I had something that I thought was important, and I was lucky enough to have friends and family and ultimately a publisher who agreed with me.
Nice. So, can I ask from your experience then, what does stepping back into faith as a queer person look like?
Yeah. So I really, for me, and people come at this from different directions, right? I
Mm-hmm.
had really already gone through a lot of deconstruction, really thinking through what it is I believed. So I was coming at this experience already believing certain things. So I wasn't worried about my theology. I was more worried about the practice of faith. If I believe that I am wonderfully and perfectly made, that I'm already at the place where I'm like, God loves me, God loves my marriage, God, like, I'm not worried about the theology of whether God loves queer people or not. I'm already there, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's an important caveat, that I'm far enough down that road that now I'm worried about the practice of faith. And that gets really tricky. How do you pray to a God when growing up, prayer was used as a weapon against you to pray the gay away? How do you engage in worship when every song you sing takes you back to that sad, closeted middle schooler raising your hands in a dimly lit room surrounded by people who bullied you mercilessly, right? Like, all of these questions are really at the forefront of how do you engage in this practice that was so deeply harmful? And what I found along the way is that it really, for me, boils down to person centered practices as opposed to dogmatic ones. So, when you read scripture, are you allowing yourself to be present among those pages, or is it being interpreted through people who have no stake in the game? And what I mean by that is, can you take the spot of someone in the story? You, with your queer experience, with your queer body, what do you have to say about what scripture is doing? How do you breathe life into these pages? In terms of prayer, what does it look like for it to be more of a meditative practice instead of this laundry list of requests that you bring to God, but becoming present in your own body? And if we really believe that God is within us, then probably we should be listening to ourselves more than we listen to anyone else, because that's where answers are to whatever questions we might have. But we're taught not to trust ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're coming back to faith, being willing to center our own experience, being willing to acknowledge our pain, acknowledge the wrong that was done, but then acknowledge the strength and the hope and the creativity that we as queer people have to bring to this faith, in fact, making it more vibrant rather than less, is a really phenomenal turn of phrase in our own mind. It flips things on its head when we put ourselves at the center of what we're doing instead of the dogmatics that the church has put around us all of those years.
So, has anybody who you've at least interacted with and has been working on the reconstructing of self and faith come to you and said, "But what I miss most is community"?
Yes, and that is really tricky. And part of the journey for me was wanting to step back into a church, like wanting to be able to sit in a pew and not feel gross. That was genuinely part of my personal goal. It is hard, and I think that it has to be at its own pace. I think that often we are inadvertently forcing people back through the doors because we think that that is what faith community looks like. And I don't think that necessarily has to be so. I think that, sitting through a Sunday morning service is great. But what I began to realize is that if sitting in a pew on a Sunday morning was actually pushing me further away from God because of the feelings of resentment and trauma filling my body from past experiences, then it's not actually church anymore. It's becoming something else, right? If the idea of church is to bring you in closer connection with the divine, if it's doing the opposite of that, then it's become something that's not church anymore for you. And so I think you have to be willing to take a step back, reevaluate. Maybe a walk with your partner or a walk with your friend is more church for you this week than stepping into a room with stained glass windows. Maybe reading a book on your porch, community with fictional characters, might be more akin to church to you some week than going to a physical building. For me, theater was church for years. The community that I found amidst creative people was so much more welcoming and so much more affirming than my experience with church had been up to that point. And when I started wanting to walk back through church doors, which was years, I left the church and didn't even walk through a door for years. But it wasn't until I was dating my now husband, the second one, not the abusive one, that I was willing to step back in. It took someone sitting next to me for me to be willing to take that step. And I think that's really important too, to have someone that makes you feel safe, that makes you feel comfortable, so that when those feelings inevitably arise, there's someone there to help ground you a little bit. I'm not sure that I would be in church today if I didn't have someone to have walked with me through the doors the first 1, 3, 40 times, right? And I think when we're talking about community, a lot of times it's going to start with one person or just a couple of folks, and then that can build out. But I don't think that church has to be church the way that we define it. I think that the things that are bringing you to a closer connection to the divine is church. That's what church is supposed to do. And so I think it can be a lot of different things along your journey.
Right. So you touched on playwriting.
I did.
Did your work as a playwright influence this?
So yes, growing up, I loved to write. I was the weird kid writing poems and short stories like back in elementary school. Like I would rather read a book and write a story than do most anything else. But I think that love of writing fell away a bit through college and through grad school. You're writing so much for classes that the joy kind of gets sucked out of it, I think. And so it just kind of fell by the wayside, not because I didn't love it anymore, but just I wasn't doing it. I was fueling my creativity elsewhere. I'd found theater and was really pouring myself into that. But through my love of theater, I really started encountering new work. So not doing the musicals and the plays of the past, but people who are living and writing right now. And I started working with playwrights, and I started saying, I could do this too. And so through playwriting, I think this book was born in the sense that theater, which felt safe and creative for me, helped me to rediscover my love of writing. And I think that if I hadn't come back to writing through theater, that I wouldn't have been brave enough to write this book. So I think in the sense that playwriting was kind of my way back in to finding my own voice, that it very much influenced this book.
Nice.
And I think that the creativity that comes with playwriting is very different. I mean, you're encapsulating an entire story through dialogue. All you get to know are the words that come out of people's mouth. But I think what that teaches you is how important words are. And so in this book, it's not fiction. These are my words, they're my life, they're my advice. And so I wanted to make sure that all of them were true, that all of them had something to say, that all of them were moving forward the thing that I wanted people to walk away with. So I don't think I can divorce playwriting from book writing. It all kind of comes from the same well for me. But I think that this book wouldn't exist if I hadn't first started writing plays.
And led the life that you led.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for so long that my creative theater self felt very separate from kind of this faith-centered self. It felt like two separate parts of me. I've been a theater professional, but my training is, I have a master's of divinity. I'm a seminary trained faith leader, but I have not used that in the traditional way of being a part of congregational ministry in my professional adult life. And so this book really felt like a joining of those two aspects of my identity, an integration of myself, if you will. I think this book allowed me to feel more whole as opposed to separating those things out. That I can be a seminary trained person who also writes plays and does theater, but has something to offer the church. And I think that's what I've walked away with, and what I always want people to walk away with when I'm speaking at churches and doing events related to my book, is that queer people have something so beautiful to offer the church.
Mm-hmm.
What I think marginalized groups of people can relate to the story of Jesus so much more than those in power, because Jesus wasn't in power. Jesus was on the fringes, and he was hanging out with people on the fringes. There's a line in my book that says Jesus would have been marching in pride parades and turning water to wine at gay weddings everywhere if he were alive today, right? Like, that's who Jesus was in the Bible. And so much of the church has just lost that along
Right.
the way. It's lost its flavor, it's lost its vigor. And if there's anything the queer community has to offer, it's creativity, it's perspective, it's that flavor and vigor that's so often lacking.
Right.
So it's been exciting through this book to bring those different aspects of my identity together and for them to be affirmed. Not everywhere, but in the places that I've been invited to go, it's been really healing to step into a church and feel celebrated and welcomed as opposed to reviled. It's been a wild ride.
Have you been invited to a large number of churches?
A fair number. I mean, my book just came out in June, and I've done close to a dozen book events between church and non-church entities, and churches specifically. Probably 6 or 7 different churches have had me speak or preach or talk about my book, which feels really strange still. There's still a part of me, even after all of this, that feels out of place
Mm-hmm.
speaking from like a pulpit kind of situation.
Right.
Um, it feels good, but it still feels strange. Like, there's part of me that's like, how did I end up here? Like, I wasn't planning to do this. Writing a book is one thing, but speaking up here with the cross behind me, like, that's a little much.
When did I become this ambassador?
Exactly.
All
But I
right.
think that's part of the joy of being an author, is it puts you in places that you weren't expecting. And
Mm-hmm.
if you believe in what you wrote, it's a joy to be on that unexpected journey.
Gotcha. Did you have any questions, Bass?
Yeah, I don't want to come across as combative, but I come from the Catholic Church, and obviously there is a number of things. So first off, I wanted to ask, what denomination are we talking here? Because that does have a bearing
It
in your
does.
conversation.
So my experience, so growing up, I was Southern Baptist, which is part of the anti-queer rhetoric was really strong growing up. I even went to a Baptist seminary, like that, like all the way through. That was what I was experiencing, was the Southern Baptist hate, frankly. I Interestingly, so I wouldn't identify as Baptist. That being said, interestingly enough, my husband and I attend an affirming Baptist church at the moment. They exist. I know people, that is the exact face that people give me when
That
I
has
say
got to
that.
be the most contradictory statement I have
I
ever
know.
heard
I
on the
know. No.
subject of religion.
I know. And like, I acknowledge that fully, and yet it is real. Like, so Baptist churches are not governed by like a body in the same way that like the Catholic Church is, right? So there are Baptist conventions that lots of churches are connected to, like Southern Baptist Convention that so many churches are connected to, and it's hateful. However, you can just be an individual denomination that's Baptist doing your own thing, because there's not a diocese that you have to be related to in the same way that like a Catholic denomination or an Episcopal denomination or even a Methodist denomination is. So the church we attend right now is just an affirming Baptist church. They're connected to World Baptist Alliance, which is a more affirming segment of Baptists. Several of the other churches I've been invited to since the book came out are Baptist churches. And it sounds strange. It feels contradictory, like in your bones, depending on your experience with religion. And yet it's true. And there's something encouraging about that fact that there is a diversity of
I'm
people,
wondering though,
even among Baptists.
I'm wondering though if you have, and I'm not sure where you are in the country.
I'm in
Uh,
Texas, so.
Actually, where in Texas? Because the reason I'm asking is there are queer churches, the
Yeah.
MCC.
Yes.
There
And
are,
I've
and there are also
spoken at an
Unitarian
MC.
churches.
Yes.
There are, so there are options and
There
avenues.
are. There
you know,
are.
And while I'm a card-carrying atheist, I've left all of that behind me, and even gone through my own cancer journey. I
Yeah.
had a boss who was deeply religious, and she always used to love to say, "There are no atheists in the foxholes." Huh. Foxhole, never prayed. So I have this distrust and side eye. I mean, I don't have a problem with people who are spiritual and
Mm-hmm.
carry a spirituality with them. Where
Yeah.
I run into problems and where I see it as very problematic is any type of organized religion, because when people get involved in that sense, yes, you can have community, but it often is a structure of power. And it's often a structure of someone telling that's why it's called the flock, telling the flock how to interpret something. And I find a greater connection with someone who's spiritual, who may have their own individualistic journey, but aren't beholden to any one given denomination, because then I know they're reasoning for themselves. And so my question to you in your journey for this, have you found yourself at any time having to compromise with yourself in order to make this affirming Baptist church work?
So I deeply appreciate you sharing and everything you brought up, because I think it's important. You brought up the Metropolitan Community Church, and I've spoken at one of those this fall as well, and they're amazing. I mean, they are a queer church. It's like their
Yes,
whole thing, and
absolutely.
it's amazing. Um,
I've been to
in
several
my
of their services,
yeah,
so I've been.
in my book, I even specifically mention Metropolitan Community Church and Unitarian Universalism as this ray of hope, as this thing of
What
the
could be.
church is so much bigger than I was raised to think
Right.
it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is so important. And when we're thinking about theology, it matters so much to realize what the array is, that it's not all this dogmatic exclusivity, but that
Mm-hmm.
there are people who are willing to accept people along all avenues of their journey. For myself, I will say that where we live is a little strange in terms of what is available church wise. So I'm in Waco, Texas, and
Or
it
as I like to call it, Wacko, Texas.
it is. That's
That's a whole
fair.
nother
And people
episode.
who live here say that. Um, but so we're in Waco, Texas, and there's not a lot of options in terms of affirming churches. We're in a strange denominational landscape wherein there are actually more affirming Baptist churches than there are other types of denominations, simply because there's more Baptists than anything else.
Hmm.
Um, so I recognize that I'm in kind of a weird milieu of church here. And so I don't feel that I've compromised, because where I am, it actually genuinely is the best option for us, the most affirming. Like this is where we feel safe and at home. And it's not a compromise like, oh, I guess I'll go here. It's like, no, this actually feels good. The pastor is wonderful, he's who performed our marriage last summer, was the pastor of this Baptist church. And so, but that's not going to be true for everyone. Most people, when I talk to most people in other places, I'm encouraging them to look at metropolitan community churches. I'm encouraging them to look for Methodist churches that split from United
Yeah, be
Methodism.
sure you
Yes, it's an important caveat. I'm encouraging them to look at their Episcopal churches in town. I'm encouraging them to look at their ECLA Lutheran churches in town, right? Like there are, quite frankly, many more denominations who have a history of being far more affirming than Baptists. That's just not the reality where I happen to live. Um, and I think that along my journey, part of it was that I had no interest in being beholden to organized church. Part of my personal journey was wanting to be back in church, but part of that was that I didn't want it to have power over me. And what I mean by that is I didn't want to not feel comfortable being a part of a church when it had been so important to me growing up. For me, part of reclaiming my faith was not letting that trauma of organized religion have power over me. And so for my journey, becoming again a part of a congregation felt important because I didn't want my negative experiences to keep me from something that I wanted. So I think when we're talking about power structures, for me, it was part of retaking that power to become a part of this community again.
Nice.
So I
do
think
you
that
still
answers
find
your
do you
yeah.
still find there are moments where your spidey senses are still up, or have you passed that threshold where you no longer have to be, oh wait, what was that? Oh, okay, that's okay, we're good,
I think that if you live on the margins, your spidey senses are always up. I think that's just kind of par for the course, right?
Mhm.
But I think what I advocate for is for congregations to recognize that as a strength. I want a church that wants to hear about my spidey sense going up. I want a church that says, when you feel the ick, you need to let us know, right?
Right.
Because frankly, there's going to be no congregation. I think even metropolitan community, like even the best of us, anytime you get a group of people together, there's going to be times when someone does something that's actually not in keeping with their values, right?
Right, well,
That's
which
just the
is
nature
exactly
of
what
being
that
human.
was my point, was that, you get to a place where it's, the organized religion, anytime humans become involved, you're going to have those issues arise because people are not really wanting to give up their own position on those kinds of dynamics. And so you often find that you compromise even when you don't realize you are in many respects, because you're having to work within the structure of the people that are in that community with you. And so, like I said, for me, I find that I can deal with people who are spiritual, who have their own journey, because then I'm dealing on a one-to-one. Then I can have an in-depth conversation. I can talk about spiritual things, even though I may not partake of it, but I can talk with that person because I feel that person has reasoned and is finding things and maybe using it as a moral compass to enrich their
Mm-hmm.
lives. Great. I'm down with that. I'm good with that. But I think any kind of organized religion, no matter how much you may propagate and hold up that, oh, we accept everyone, do you? I mean, you may have that feeling and that emotion now. And I'm not trying to dissuade you from going where you're going. Please don't take it that way. But what I'm trying to say is that I often find that people tend to go with community and the safety in numbers, but don't realize what they're giving up in that process by making subtle compromises in order to maintain the community. And I know that is kind of the definition of community, but I'm just saying, for something that's so deeply personal, it almost seems like you trade something away when you join any kind of organized physical church. I mean, there was a comedian who used to make the running joke about, well, church is where you are. Why do I have to go down the block to a building and put money in a basket. And, why am I doing that when in all reality, church is where I am at any given moment, and my connection to the divine is right here. I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to have some, and a lot of these religions tend to cafeteriaize what it is that they hold as their values. They don't really look at scripture and the book in its totality. They pick and choose what it is that they want to promote, and often to the detriment or to the benefit of the community that they're serving. So that's where I struggle with a lot of this. I mean, I find what you're saying very encouraging, and I love everything that you're saying.
Yeah. But
It's just those are my concerns.
No, and I think they're valid concerns. I don't think you can do work around scripture, around church, around spirituality, period, without grappling with exactly what you're saying, right? I think if you're not asking yourself those questions, bringing those questions to people you trust, that you're not doing it in an honest way. You're putting blinders on and just hoping for the best, right? So I think that everything you're saying is real. I think part of my response to it would be that the church it's not going anywhere. And why I say that is that I think that there is encouragement in everything I've said, that it's much more diverse than often we realize it is, because there's so many segments of it, many of which are far more affirming than others, right? I grew up only really knowing Southern Baptist, and now as an adult, I recognize the plethora of options that are available to people of all different backgrounds and identities, which is beautiful. But the church at large is here. And I think, like with any structure, because that's what the church is, right? It's a structure, like what you're saying. There's power to be protected, power to be preserved, all of those things. But if there aren't people willing to come back in and say, these are the ways in which I was hurt by this power that's being preserved. These are the ways in which it is not working. That people are seeing the inconsistencies. They are seeing the cherry picking. Like, you're not subtle. You're not doing the thing that you think you're doing. You're not hiding away the hate. It's in the daylight. Everyone is here to see it. If people aren't willing to step back into the congregations and speak to that power, then I'm not sure it's going to change. And I think that in some ways, like you're saying, it's impossible to not compromise in little ways. I mean, that's part of community, right? As we've agreed that we are seeking to live well together. That being said, I don't think that you have to compromise on what you know to be true about loving people well, right? There's a difference between compromising on the way that a worship service is conducted versus compromising on the way in which we talk about trans people, right? Like, these are two very different issues. Mm-hmm. And I think, though, that we need folks who are willing to say that a community necessitates accountability and a community necessitates conversation. If you say something from the pulpit that you're not even realizing is a problem, this has to be a community in which I can say that was a problem. Mm-hmm. And a really good example of that is there was an instance not that long ago when forgiveness was brought up. And forgiveness is wonderful and important and all those things, whatever. It has caveats. And what I mean by that is, as someone who is an abuse survivor, you don't get to tell me that forgiveness is this highest value that is my responsibility to bestow freely and personally. Like, that's not actually how forgiveness works, right? Yeah. My safety is actually the priority. I'm never going to forgive my abuser to his face, for example. That's not my responsibility. It's not my problem. I've given him to God. Pissed about it as I am. Oh, did I cut out for a second?
Yeah.
Yeah, just for a split
second. So I've given my ex-husband to God, and it is God's to deal with. And I think God's probably just as pissed about how I was treated as I am, right? But I talked to the pastor afterward. I was like, you cannot bring forgiveness to the pulpit without acknowledging the harms that people have experienced and saying that forgiveness requires safety, right? This is not our responsibility to give to them in a personal way.
Mhm.
Forgiveness is
Yeah,
as much a state of mind
yeah,
as it is
yes.
words, right?
Yes,
If I've
because I mean,
let
it's like
go,
telling a rape victim, "Oh, you should forgive the rapist." Wait a minute. Have you been raped? Have you been through this process? Do you
right,
know what I'm dealing with? It's so easy for others to do that. Anyways,
right,
I didn't want to take us down this path this deeply, but I think it is a conversation that a lot of atheists and spiritual people
yeah,
need to have because I think accountability is at the root of all of this. And
yes.
unfortunately, for a lot of the religious sect, they tend not to want to have any accountability in the wrongs that they propagate and put out there. They just prefer to hold themselves to whatever they've been indoctrinated with. But I think it's wonderful that you're doing this work because it enables these kinds of accountable conversations. And I think
And I
that's a wonderful thing.
And I think for people who are looking for community, faith community, I mean, community in general, but perhaps particularly faith community, what we're talking about is one of the things that you need to be looking for,
Right.
right? I would argue that if your faith community is not one in which you could bring that type of accountability into the space, that it might not be the one for you, right? If
Mhm.
Right.
they're not ready to have those conversations, it's probably not the one in which you're going to be able to do this type of healing.
Right.
So
Right.
I think it's a conversation that's important. But as for, why enter back in, I think that's part of it. Because if there aren't people willing to speak up, we won't see the propagation of more communities being willing to take on that type of accountability.
Right.
Right.
The unfortunate truth is that it often isn't change isn't going to come from the outside with a structure like church. It has to come from the inside because they're not going to be willing to always hear what the outside has to say, right? And I think that's true with any sort of group dynamic. People are always going to be more willing to accept change from within as opposed to without. And so I think for people whose journeys take them back to church, that's part of the journey, is saying, here's what I have to offer. It's going to require change on your part and it might be uncomfortable, but this is the trade-off for having me here, is that you have to
Right.
be willing to do these things.
Yeah.
Well said. I will add lastly to all the theater kids out there, just remember that theater is the church of the arts.
It's
Yep.
true. Theater,
Yep.
I said theater was my ministry for like years. I
Yeah.
would still say that. I have better conversations with artists during rehearsal than I ever will with Christians during a Bible study. That's just
Right. I
true.
just wanted
Yep.
the theater kids. Oh, we're known that we feed them.
All right, Trent, are you ready for our get to know you questions?
I'm so ready.
Take it away, Besh.
Okay. Well, in this year of diving deeper, what is your favorite writing snack or drink?
Tea. Always tea. Always have
No,
a mug at hand.
Nice.
right there with you. Lipton peach. All right. What books did you grow up reading?
I grew up reading lots of kind of YA fantasy things. I mean, we're not allowed to say anymore that we read Harry Potter, but I did read Harry Potter. I read like Redwall and, anything that had magic and, or like omniscient animals. Like, that's what I was here for.
I don't really have I mean, I understand people's problem with J.K. Rowling, and definitely I'm on board with everything they're saying. But at the same time, it's like, if you don't, there's a great book called The Education of Little Tree, and it's written by a KKK member, and it's about the evils that were visited upon a Native American child in a boarding school. And it is so beautifully written. How would we write off a story like that just because someone who wrote it was problematic?
Hmm.
So it's kind of like there's this weird space. So I think, be okay with that you read it,
I did. I loved it.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Next question. Who's been the biggest supporter of your writing?
My husband.
Yeah.
I started right.
There is only one right answer.
There is, and I got it right. I passed. But genuinely, I started writing it while we were dating. And the first draft of the book, it had like boyfriend, fiance, husband. Like it had the different iterations of our relationship as I was writing it. So when I edited it, I had to go back and be like, my now husband. Like I had to make it all make sense.
There you go. Okay, well, are you a morning person or a night owl?
I'm one of those weird people that's really both. Like my slump is the afternoon. Like I
Yeah,
love
power
mornings,
naps.
I love evenings. I just don't need as much sleep as most people. That's
Oh,
just,
I love power naps. You'll find when you get older, like me, an older cat in the neighborhood, trust me, power naps become a wonderful thing. All right. Well, what's your favorite hobby outside of writing?
it's a cop out to say reading, but I love to read.
There's nothing
And
wrong with
then
that.
I'm theater. I mean, theater is my job, but it's really also my hobby. I would do it if I didn't get paid a dime.
Right. You're on a literary podcast. Trust me, we're with you. All right. Has writing and publishing a book changed the way you see yourself?
It has. I mean, I think I kind of already talked about it, but it really integrated these different parts of my identity that before felt very separate. It felt like these different versions of me that I was in different spaces depending on who I was talking to or what I was doing. And now I just kind of get to bring it all into every room, which is really freeing.
It's kind of like a collective focus group. Okay, we can all come in now. you know. All right. Well, in the journey of writing this, if have you uncovered some kind of unforeseen nugget that you decide that maybe I could write even more about this aspect of it? Did something catch your fancy that you weren't
Yeah,
expecting?
so it did. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I have a chapter in the book about scripture and imagination. I think that we can't read the Bible well unless we're willing to do so with all of ourselves, which involves creativity, it involves imagination, it means bringing all of ourselves to this book. And I think that's the only way to read it well and read it truthfully. And I think that when everyone is doing that, then the diversity is what brings it alive. So the book that will be coming out either late 2025 or early 2026 is going to be about that, an entire book about scriptural imagination of what it means to interact with the Bible in a way that is holistic, in a way that is creative, in a way that's fresh and trauma informed rather than traumatizing.
Right. Well, there you go.
Mhm.
There's your tagline right there. All right. Have you ever traveled as research for your book?
Not as research. I've traveled since the book came out to share about it, but I didn't travel in the lead up.
Mm.
Okay. Well, finally, how do you celebrate when you finish the book?
I was really bad at this with this book. I need to
Oh,
figure it out. I mean, I was really pleased, but I think that anyone who's published books will tell you that in some ways it's a little underwhelming. Like, not in a bad way. It's just, the lead up is exciting, right? Like the pre-orders come out and you're like, everyone
Mhm.
pre-order this book. And then it comes out and it's like, crickets. You're like, well, now it exists. That's
yeah.
good. And then it's like, it's this weird kind of trickle effect. Okay, reviews start coming in. Oh, people are messaging you about it. Oh, maybe there's this event that's going to happen, right? And
Mhm.
then it starts to build back up.
Yeah.
But the actual, like, publish date is this weird middle ground where you're like, okay. So I was excited, but I didn't celebrate in a way that was exciting this time. For the next book I need to like take a trip or something. That
So,
way
There you
it
go. There
doesn't
you
matter
go.
if it's underwhelming because I'm somewhere exciting.
can
You
I
can
offer
write it
some
off.
wisdom
That's
from
the other part.
I would love some wisdom.
one of our previous guests had a really good answer. They said that they celebrated the milestones. First draft done, crack a bottle of wine with a loved one. Final draft handed in to publisher, go out to a nice dinner. You know, celebrate the milestones.
A
Yeah.
tier list.
First review on Amazon. Woohoo! Throw a party or get on favorite social media and do a post about it.
Yeah. No, I
Celebrate the.
think that's good. I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, because it's such a lonely craft. You really need
It
to do
really
things to
is.
It is.
pat yourself on the back.
It's so different I mean, like writing a book versus writing a play is
Mhm.
such a different experience because a
Yeah.
play isn't real until it's in a
Until it's
room with a
mounted.
bunch of actors and a director, right? It's a community endeavor.
Yeah.
Like the editing process literally involves a cast of people because you can't edit it until you hear it out loud. And then the book is like you're just on your computer reading it for the third, fourth, 12th time, like, so it's such a different experience. I love them both, but the book, in order to not feel lonely, you have to include some people close to you. Like if
Yeah.
I didn't have a friend I was sending chapters to and getting feedback in real time, like I don't know if I'd have finished it. Like it would have been depressing. So you have to make it less lonely in the ways that you can.
Celebrate the milestones.
That's
Well,
right.
you made it through the list. Bravo.
So I usually ask at this point what's coming up next, but you just teased a next book.
I did. Yeah. I don't, it doesn't have a title yet, or I would tell you. It's still a little far. It's about a year out from being published, probably. The manuscript is due in the spring, so it'll be late 25, early 26 that it comes out.
Do you have any upcoming appearances you want people to know about?
No, I kind of took a holiday break. This is that weird in between time.
Yep.
So I was like, we're not doing anything. We're just gonna enjoy the holidays for what they are and come back
There you
in the
go.
new year.
Yeah.
So
Fair.
I have like play things, but nothing related to the book. So that'll be 2025 that starts rolling back around.
All
There
right.
you go.
Well, and I'm glad you said that. So if people who want to see some of your playthings and follow you there, they go to trentclifford.com and your socials
Yes.
are there. But if they're more interested in the faith and this book, they go to reclaimingfaith.org and your links and book are there. Correct?
Absolutely. And the theater site will link them over to Reclaiming Faith as well, but
Perfect.
that's the separation. Even if I'm integrated as a person, the audiences don't have quite the overlap, so they live in two different places.
Totally fair. All right. Do you have any final words of wisdom?
I I just want more people to write about things like this. Like I said, I didn't set out to write a book. It just kind of happened. But I encourage people to chronicle their journey and write about the things that are important to them. I deeply wish that there had, mine is not the only book about queerness and faith. I'm under no delusion. But when I was growing up, there really were not any of the good kind. There were plenty of the bad kind about queerness and faith growing up, but there weren't any like this that let me be everything that I was. And so I still don't think we have enough of books like this. I want more people to share, and I want the community to grow. So that would be my word of encouragement, is to write the thing you're scared to write. I was scared to write this, and yet here we are, and it's been a beautiful journey. So write scared.
Love it. All right, folks, we'd like to extend a huge thank you to Trent Clifford for joining us. Trent, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.
It was our pleasure. All right, we at Written on the Edge are proud to introduce you to new media by queer content creators. So if you enjoy learning about new artists or hearing our thoughts on entertainment media, please like and subscribe so you get the alerts for new episodes. We are on Blue Sky now, so if you're on that app, please follow us, like, and help us promote and help us find.
Oh God,
past-
now I gotta do a whole new end screen for our videos.
and help us find old friends from that other dead space to come
Yeah.
follow us on Blue Sky. All right, the show is produced by Rogue Ravens Media. For our disclaimers, links to social media, our listen stations, or to sign up as a guest, visit www.rotepodcast.com. Tune in next week for your queer media fix.
Oh, what's that? Closing time. The bums rush in melody, dear.